Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Navigating the COVID-19 Vaccine in the Workplace, Answering Your Common Questions, presented by Rea Associates, a top 100 regional CPA and business consulting firm, and Critchfield Johnston, a full-service law firm. My name is Imani Fields, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. First, if you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them into the chat box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of today's presentation. However, to be respectful of your time, we know that we will not be able to get to them all. Therefore, following today's webinar, we will review all questions and send out the answers via email as soon as we can. When you receive this email, you'll also receive the recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to participate in a very short evaluation. Please take a few minutes to share your thoughts about the presentation as a whole, the information provided, and our presenters. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you will find that they're available in the Handouts section of the webinar dashboard on your computer screen. The attorneys of Critchfield Johnston, Ltd. have prepared the content of this webinar for informational and educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. Further, your participation in this webinar does not create an attorney-client relationship. Participants should not act upon any information presented on this webinar without seeking professional legal counsel. The legal information provided in this webinar is general and should not be relied on as legal advice, which Critchfield and Johnston Ltd. attorneys cannot provide without full consideration of all relevant information relating to one's individual situation. Today's webinar will be given by Kimberly L. Hall and Renee West. Kim practices Critchfield and Johnston Employees Law Group, where she counsels employers and employment law matters and assist employers on best practices in the areas of hiring, firing, and other disciplinary actions, conducting internal investigations, and maintaining effective and compliant employee policies and regulations. Renee West is a senior manager and leader of Rea Associates HR consulting practice. With more than 27 years of experience in human resources, Renee specializes in assisting organizations with the manufacturing, nonprofit, contingent staffing, food, and other industries with their HR challenges. She is also serving on the Ohio Society of Human Resource Management, SHRM Board of Directors, as Central District Director. And now I will pass it on to you, Kim.
Thank you. Next slide. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm excited to team up with Rea Associates again. I know Rea Associates has done a fantastic job of keeping everybody updated and doing numerous webinars throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, so I'm happy to be here again. My portion of the presentation today, I'm going to discuss vaccination policies. I'm going to hit on three key questions. First, is it legal for employers to require that their employees be vaccinated as a condition of continued employment? Second, what are the legal limitations on mandatory vaccination policies if employers do choose to implement such policies? And third, what alternatives are there to mandatory vaccination policies if you're not prepared to go the full way to requiring vaccinations as a condition of continued employment? What are the other options available to you? Next slide. So it is legal under federal and state law for employers to implement mandatory vaccination policies. However, there are some key considerations you must take into account if you're planning on implementing a mandatory vaccination policy. First, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. Second, we have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And third, it's not really a legal consideration, but even though you are permitted to require mandatory vaccination policies, should you require mandatory vaccination policies? So that third consideration is a potential employee relations issue. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you do decide to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, is that the best thing to do for your company and your workforce? Next slide. So according to the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEO laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, continue to apply during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, employers are permitted to follow guidelines imposed by the Centers for Disease Control, as well as local and state health authorities to help protect the company and the employees from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, please keep in mind that the CDC's guidance, as most of us know, tends to change on a pretty regular basis. So if you're going to be relying on the CDC guidance, as you should also be checking the CDC's website on a regular basis to make sure you are following the most up-to-date guidance. Next slide. So if you do choose to implement a mandatory vaccination policy for your company, you need to consider the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, like I touched on earlier. So once you have made the decision to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, you need to consider accommodation requirements, which would potentially require you to make an exception to the mandatory vaccination policy. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you would need to consider accommodations due to an employee's disability. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, you would need to consider accommodations due to an employee's sincerely held religious beliefs. So we have two key potential accommodations that would be required. That's for disability and religion. Next slide. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I've sort of summarized the accommodation process here. This is a very simplified summary of what employers need to do in order to comply with their obligations to provide accommodations to employees with disabilities. So the way it would generally work is you would implement your mandatory vaccination policy if you choose to do so. An employee requests an exemption to the vaccine due to the employee's disability. For example, if an employee has a immune system disorder that would cause them to not be able to get the vaccination safely, the employee might approach the employer and request an accommodation. The employer then has the obligation to engage in the interactive process, which is a back and forth dialogue with the employee to try and find an accommodation that would help the employee still perform the essential functions of their job. And then at the conclusion of the interactive process, the employer would need to provide a reasonable accommodation that does not pose an undue hardship on the company, which is defined as significant difficulty or expense. Next slide. When going through this process and deciding if you can provide an accommodation to an employee who does not want to or cannot get the vaccine due to a disability, consider some of these factors here. The amount of employees who have been vaccinated. For example, do you have a workforce who is largely vaccinated and the employee would just be a small outlier if they don't get the vaccine? Consider the amount of the unvaccinated employees' contact with others, as well as the unvaccinated employee's position. For example, does this employee have to work with the public on a regular basis, or maybe this employee is able to perform his or her job functions from home? Next slide. Some possible reasonable accommodations that you could consider. For example, if the employee cannot get vaccinated, maybe you can provide that employee with additional personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, or if they want to assign them to a more remote work location, or maybe even allow them to work from home if they're able to perform the essential functions of their job from home. Next slide. And going through this accommodation process, it's important that managers and supervisors responsible for communicating the vaccine requirement to employees, it's important that they know how to recognize an accommodation request from an employee with a disability and know how to process that request. If you're directing it to human resources, for example, the managers and supervisors need to know who in human resources is processing these accommodation requests. Next slide. And it's also important to keep in mind that the employer cannot disclose that an employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation or retaliate against an employee for requesting accommodation. So if coworkers get curious about why somebody is not required to comply with a mandatory vaccine requirement, it would not be permissible for an employer to say, for example, this employee is not required to get vaccinated due to the employee's disability. That must be kept confidential. Next slide. And the ADA requires employers to keep any employee medical information obtained in the course of the vaccination program confidential. Next slide. So question, is asking or requiring an employee to show proof of receipt of a COVID-19 vaccination a disability-related inquiry restricted by the Americans with Disabilities Act? So just brief background, the Americans with Disabilities Act restricts when an employer can make a disability-related inquiry or require a medical examination of an employee. So is requiring proof of a vaccine, a disability-related inquiry that would be restricted by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide. No, simply requesting proof of receipt of a COVID-19 vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. However, if you as an employer are implementing mandatory vaccination programs, you should not go beyond asking proof of the vaccination. For example, you should not be asking why somebody did or did not get the vaccination, because if somebody does not get a vaccination and you ask them why, it's possible that the employee could say, I didn't get vaccinated due to this underlying medical condition. And so if an employer does implement a mandatory vaccination program and asks an employee to provide proof that they have received a COVID-19 vaccination from a pharmacy or their own healthcare provider, the employer should tell the employee to not provide any additional medical information aside from the simple proof of the receipt of the vaccine. For example, the employer should not request family history, family medical history, the employee's allergies, the employee's pre-existing medical conditions. That should not be something the employee is providing to the employer in this vaccination process. Next slide. So we touched on the disability accommodation process. Now turning to the religious accommodation process, it's very similar to what we discussed with disability accommodation. The way it would happen is the employee would indicate he or she is unable to receive a COVID-19 vaccination because of a sincerely held religious practice or belief. The employer would be obligated to go through the interactive process, which is a back and forth dialogue to determine if the employer can provide a reasonable accommodation that does not pose an undue hardship. Here, with religious accommodations, undue hardship means more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employer. Next slide. So what qualifies as a religious belief? Religious beliefs are very broad. The EEOC guidance explains that because the definition of religion is so broad and protects beliefs with which the employer may be unfamiliar, the employer should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for religious accommodation is based on a sincerely held religious belief. If, however, an employee requests an accommodation, an employer has an objective basis for questioning either the religious nature or the sincerity of a particular belief, practice, or observance, the employer would be justified in requesting additional supporting information. I would caution that that should be done in very limited circumstances. We know that there are a wide variety of religious beliefs, and unless the employer really has an objective basis for questioning the sincerity of that belief, that really there shouldn't be any further inquiry regarding the nature of that employee's religious belief. If the employer does choose to request additional information, the employer should keep in mind that additional information need not take any specific form. For example, the employee's own explanation of their religious belief could be sufficient. If an employee has information from others who are familiar with that employee's religious belief, that could be sufficient. The employer cannot specifically require that a statement from a clergy member be provided, for example. Next slide. So what does not qualify as a religious belief? Social, political, or economic philosophies or personal preferences are not religious beliefs under Title VII. So if an employee says they object to getting the vaccine because they question whether it is medically effective, that does not qualify as a religious belief under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and the employee would not be entitled to an accommodation due to that personal belief if the employer does have a mandatory vaccination program. Next slide. So once the employer implements the mandatory vaccination program, if that's something they want to do, and they go through the accommodation process, both for disabilities and religion, an employer decides that they cannot provide a reasonable accommodation to that employee with the sincerely held religious belief or the disability, then what happens? If the employee cannot get vaccinated due to the disability or the religious belief, and there's no reasonable accommodation available, the employer would be able to exclude the employee from the workplace. However, this process should be done with caution and in conjunction with legal counsel, and employers should not just jump to terminating an employee if an employee is unable to get the vaccine due to disability or religion. It should always be done in close consultation with legal counsel. Next slide. So if you as an employer are not prepared to go forward with mandating vaccines, whether you don't feel like you're equipped to handle the disability or religious accommodation process, or if you think your workforce isn't going to be receptive to the mandatory vaccination policy, there's some alternatives you have available to you. First, you can simply encourage employees to get the vaccine. You can come out with a statement that says it's the company's stance that it thinks getting the vaccine is a good thing, and it encourages employees to get the vaccine. Or employers can go a step further and provide incentives to employees to get the vaccine. For example, an employer might provide employees with paid time off for the time it takes them to go get the vaccine, or it might provide a small cash incentive. But if you're going to go down the road of providing incentives to employees to get the vaccine, you will need to consider whether you need to provide an alternative. So employees with disabilities and sincerely held religious beliefs can get the incentive by participating in an alternative program. For example, they could take an online course on COVID-19 vaccine safety, and that would allow them to get the same incentive payment as the employees who do go and get the vaccine. Next slide. So some best practices, just to summarize what we've discussed today. First, it's good to have a written policy in place. Even if you're not mandating the vaccine of your employees, it's good for employees to be able to know where the company stands on the vaccine requirement and what the company is going to expect of employees. So in that written policy, you can detail whether employees are mandated to get the vaccine, whether it's just a purely voluntary program and employees are just encouraged to get the vaccine, or whether the vaccine program is going to be incentive-based. And in that policy, if you are providing incentives to employees, or if you're mandating the vaccine, you want to detail how employees with disabilities or sincerely held religious beliefs can go about requesting an accommodation if they're unable to get the vaccine due to the disability or their religion. You also want to ensure and communicate to employees that the company will be maintaining the confidentiality of vaccine records. And also importantly, if you have unionized employees, if you're going to go through the process of mandating a vaccine, you need to first consult the collective bargaining agreement to see if that's even permitted. Next slide. All right, well, that's all I have for today. I appreciate your time, and now on to Renee West.
Thank you, Kim. We appreciate you joining the webinar today, and thank you everyone for attending. So for this portion of the webinar, we are going to focus on a couple updates as it relates to the American Recovery Act, specifically the FFCRA leave. We're also going to talk through some HR best practices in communications with employees. And we're also going to share some common scenarios and questions that I've received either through clients or colleagues, and offer some recommendations as well as we move forward. Next slide, please. The American Recovery Plan Act was signed earlier by the President, and there have been a couple updates to the FFCRA leave. However, we do want to just review a couple of the preliminary items that are still in play. Keep in mind that this FFCRA leave is still a voluntary program that employers are able to offer employees, and there are in fact tax credits in participating in this program. The FFCRA leave does apply to all employers between 50 to 500 total employees. And as of April 1st, 2021, there is another 10 days that have been added to the FFCRA emergency leave, which is available to employees that would meet the eligibility criteria for this leave. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those criteria are. And this current legislation has been extended through September 30th of this year. Next slide. As we mentioned before, employers are eligible for tax credits for wages paid for the FFCRA program. And the FFCRA leave has been updated to include some additional criteria for eligibility for employees. The first update is there is leave available for employees if they are obtaining a COVID-19 vaccination. Also, if they are recovering from any illness related to the vaccine. And the other one is still what has been in play all along, is if an individual is waiting for a COVID test result or a medical diagnosis for COVID. So the top two are new as part of the eligibility criteria. So it's very important for employers that are continuing to offer this leave that your forms are updated to include these two additional eligibility criteria. Next slide. We've had a lot of questions just from our discussions of how are employers communicating to their employees. Kim mentioned earlier, sharing the policies and the individual stance of an organization. And this is just some data that we pulled together that shares what resources employers are sharing with their employees. And of course, the very top one is, facts about the benefits of the vaccine, details on access to the vaccine, information about individual insurance coverages or reimbursement, trusted sources for vaccine resources, the company's stance on the vaccination policy, and some companies have even shared company leaders' experience as well. But this is just a summary from a nationwide level of what are employers doing to share these resources with their employees. Next slide. So some common questions that we're hearing and that we're starting to see from the field, and one of those is an employer required to pay employees for time taken for obtaining the COVID vaccine? And as we've noted here, per the Fair Labor Standards Act, if a vaccine is mandated by an employer, they may be required to cover the cost and pay the employee. And the labor law also states that the employer must cover any work-related expenses for the employee if the cost of the expense would drop the employee below their minimum wage. This is just a common question, and again, there's some gray areas there, but it is important to be prepared for that question in case your employees do ask. Next slide. This is another very common question. As we mentioned earlier, with the Recovery Act, it has actually resetted the 10-day limit for the tax credit for paid sick leave as of April 1st through September. And any employees that had taken time off for last year or the previous do not count in this initial FFCRA leave. Please keep in mind that since the bank has reset as of April 1st, the total FFCRA that an employee is eligible for is the 80 hours. And that is important to keep that in mind. There's been just a lot of questions, and keep in mind too, again, this is voluntary. So if employers are continuing to offer this FFCRA leave coverage, it's important that they're consistent in the administration of this as well, and continue to move that forward. Next slide. So this is a question, and I shared with our group earlier this morning a scenario with a colleague that I talked to yesterday. We are starting to hear from the workplace that there are some workplace bullying incidents and issues going around in reference to employees being vaccinated, not vaccinated, and what can an employer do in that instance. And the conversation I had yesterday was with a colleague in their workplace, and individuals on their manufacturing floor were yelling and fighting back and forth with each other and refusing to work next to each other because one had a vaccine, one did not. They just didn't feel that it was fair. So they were really going, really talking with this other employee and trying to, share their experience, and they need to get vaccine. And it was causing a lot of issues, and it was causing and impacting production. So, this is just one of the many situations that we're starting to hear. It's important that employers, of course, as an HR professional, you want to help provide resources to your frontline workers that, are dealing with some of these situations. It's important to continue to remind employees and support that you as an employer have workplace policies in place to ensure their continued protection from COVID, continuing to reinforce those policies. And also, refer back to your employee handbook. Even though we're, in a pandemic, there are still policies and procedures that are in place for a reason. The general harassment and your workplace violence policies are still in existence. So it's important that, as an employer, that you obviously adhere to those, but also be cognizant of the current situation. And again, helping your supervisors and managers to know how to respond to these type of issues, because we only expect that they will continue. Actually very, very common. So it's important that workplace violence also is a part, as you know, concern with a lot of companies. So it's important that just you're aware of your policies and what you can do as an employer as well. Next slide. This is actually a common question that goes we wanted to share because some companies are still inquiring if they have a COVID case or an employee that is exposed to COVID in the workplace, do they have to record that on their OSHA log? We provided some resources here that talks through the mandates in reference to whether or not these need to be recorded. And our next slide actually talks through the specific criteria for a recordable illness. So if that is the case, and you as an employer are looking to determine if it should be added to your OSHA log, the 3 criteria listed here need to be met to be able to add that to the log. So again, this is a lot of information. There's a lot of regulation there, but we do, provide a resource at the end of this webinar too for the website in case you do have questions specific to this type of question. Next slide. One of the other very common questions that we're hearing from the workplace is employers continuing to be concerned and want to provide resources to their employees to support their mental health. As you know, the last year has been challenging for everyone. The employees in the workplace, are as we are dealing with, potential financial issues or childcare issues, and are really struggling. And obviously that can increase absenteeism and can really, impact the workplace. So employers do have some options to continue to provide mental health resources to their employees. We've cited a specific site here on the COVID website that is a resource for employers to share with their employees, that talk through all different types of anxieties and challenges. And it's a great resource. We highly recommend that you do share this with your employees. And from an employer perspective, it's just important that you share these resources. What your employees do with them is actually up to them, but the more resources that you put out there, the more helpful, and it also helps with employee relations. And again, you want your people to be safe and healthy when they're away from the workplace, and then also in the workplace too. And you can also talk to your insurance providers. There are the options at times for employee assistance programs that are an additional resource for employers to share with their employees. And again, you know, the employer just provides this information. The employee is able to obtain resources for a number of issues, and can hopefully help to continue to support your employees' mental health as well. Next slide. So from a resource perspective, we've shared here a number of sources and opportunities for you to share these with your employees. We do expect that there are going to be quite a few questions, so we did want to leave some extra time to talk through those specific questions that you might have, or we can also share some additional scenarios and questions that we received as well. Imani, do we have any questions at this point?
Yeah, so the first question we have here, sorry, I was muted there.
Okay.
If you allow any accommodation of work from home, but are not allowed to state that this is the reason for the ability to work from home, how do you prevent an EEOC complaint for allowing one employee to work from home and not another?
Well, it's putting the employer in a tough spot, and there's really not a lot of wiggle room. If an employee is working from home and a coworker says, why does Jane get to work from home and I don't get to work from home? The employer cannot, under any circumstances, say Jane gets to work from home because she has a medical condition. The employer is really restricted to saying we as a company are complying with all our legal obligations under state and federal law, and that they can't dive into the fact that the employee working from home has a medical condition and is permitted to do that as an accommodation for a disability. So you can assure the coworkers that you're complying with your legal obligations, but you cannot share any additional information. If the employee who is still working at the work site and has requested to work from home, you need to go through the accommodation process to decide, is this employee requesting to work from home just because they want to, or have they requested to work from home because they have a disability that is preventing them from safely working in the workplace. And so you'll need to go through the accommodation process for each employee who requests the accommodation. The accommodation process is always an individualized inquiry that you have to do on a case-by-case basis. Some employees may be able to perform the essential functions of their job working from home, and some may not be. So you're not going to be able to provide equal accommodations to each employee, because it is by its very nature an individualized inquiry. For example, if you have an employee who is required to meet with the public in person on a day-to-day basis, and their essential job functions cannot possibly be performed by working remotely from home, then you might not be able to provide them with the accommodation of remote work. But you do need to consider alternative accommodations as part of your duty to engage in the interactive process. So at the end of the day, it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. But employees who get curious about why other employees are permitted to work from home, you can't really disclose any information other than assuring the employees that you're complying with your legal obligations.
Awesome. The next question we have here is, does the fact that the vaccines currently in use have only been approved under emergency use provisions by the FDA make the mandatory vaccine policy subject or organizations subject to liability if serious side effects or other vaccine issues develop in the future? So are they liable, organizations?
So that is a concern we've seen come up with employers. And the primary question that arises is, if I mandate that my employees get the vaccine and something bad happens, am I going to have a workers' compensation claim on my hands? And the answer is yes, possibly. That's we're in new territory here. But if the employer is mandating the vaccinations and having the employees vaccinated is benefiting the employer, if the employer pays for the vaccinations, if the vaccinations are done on site on the employer's premises, and the employee obviously has to get a vaccination as a condition of employment, then those factors all lend in favor of maybe there would be an allowed workers' compensation claim if the employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine. We're in a very new area here, so we haven't really been able to see the potential workers' compensation claims that have arisen, or at least I have not. With the employers I work with, I haven't seen a workers' compensation claim pop up relating to the vaccine, but it is a possibility. So it's something employers will want to consider if they're going to implement a mandatory vaccination policy.
Awesome. And you kind of touched on this question here, but it says, even if you're not requiring the vaccine, are you allowed to ask if employees have had the vaccine? If you can just kind of reiterate that.
Right. And when it comes to non-mandatory vaccine policies, if an employer is not mandating vaccines, I would shy away asking employees if they've been vaccinated. If the employer is just simply curious if people have been vaccinated, you would really need to have a good faith basis or a legitimate justification for asking employees if they have or have not been vaccinated. One thing you can do if you're simply curious about the number of workers in your workforce who have been vaccinated, you could do an anonymous poll where employees could indicate whether they have or have not been vaccinated, and maybe you would want to use the results of that poll to decide if you do want to implement a mandatory vaccination program. So I would shy away from asking employees if they've been vaccinated unless you have a mandatory vaccine program. If you are curious and are thinking about whether you're going to implement a program, maybe consider doing an anonymous poll where employees can voluntarily report if they're vaccinated or not.
Awesome. The next question we have here is, just to clarify, the FFCRA is now voluntary for employees to offer, where last year it was mandatory if you met requirements.
Yes, that is correct. It is voluntary for employers. And again, the best practice is if an employer does continue to offer that FFCRA leave, that they're consistent in their administration of that policy.
So the next question we have here is, why would an employee who has been vaccinated be fearful about working next to someone who's not vaccinated? Is there evidence that this is dangerous? If not, do we have a job? If not, do we have a job to do with employees about transmission? Let me know if you need me to repeat that.
Yeah, if you could, Imani, that would be good. Thank you.
So it says, why would an employee who has been vaccinated be fearful about working next to someone who's not vaccinated? Is there evidence that this is dangerous? If not, do we have a job? I'm assuming, do we need to let employees know about transmission, or do they have a job to pass that information along?
And that's a great question. And as Kim stated before, this is kind of uncharted territory. So, I really can't answer how a person feels if they have the vaccine or they don't. But I think, the questions that we're hearing are primarily just, again, it's just individuals in the workplace are maybe sharing their beliefs more so than previously. And, from an employer perspective, from their requirements, again, just continuing to reinforce, what are your vaccine protocols? What are your current safety and COVID related responses? What are you doing to keep your employees safe? Employers can continue to provide that and should consistently be providing updates to employees, as more people enter the workplace, as more people are coming back into the workforce. Some people are concerned, are those people bringing potential risk in? So, again, it's the employer's responsibility to continue to provide communication to their employees about what they're doing to keep them safe.
Great. The next question we have here is, I need clarity on additional 10-day with 80 hours of tax credit for sick leave. So if an employee took 10 days off last year due to being required to quarantine, but never contracted the virus, but now has gotten the virus, can they take another 10 days and get paid?
Kim, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you were going to.
Sure. No, I can jump in on this one. So if an employee, as I understand the question, while the FFCRA was mandatory, the employee qualified for their maximum amount of sick leave and they took that leave, yes, they could and should have been paid for that. And yes, the employer can claim the tax credit for that. Now that we're in the voluntary part of the FFCRA, if the employer is voluntarily continuing to provide the FFCRA sick leave, the employee now is sick, they have another qualifying reason, they have an additional 80 hours, up to 80 hours that they could qualify for that sick leave, and so they could be paid for that, and then the employer would be able to claim the tax credit for that. So assuming the first 80 hours were during mandatory, now we're in voluntary where the sick leave bank has reset for the employee. Because the employee has exhausted their sick leave during the mandatory part of the FFCRA, their leave bank was reset, and now that they qualify under a different reason, they're able to claim the FFCRA sick pay, provided, however, that the employer has continued to provide the FFCRA pay to other employees. You can't really do it on a case-by-case basis because the FFCRA, when the American Rescue Plan came out, there's new non-discrimination rules that say if the employer is going to claim a tax credit for the FFCRA sick pay, you have to be providing the leave to employees in a non-discriminatory manner. For example, you can't provide the sick leave to full-time employees and deny it to part-time employees. You can't discriminate between supervisors and non-supervisors or highly compensated employees. You need to be doing it on a consistent basis, which what Renee touched on earlier.
Great. The next question I have here is, if everyone is vaccinated in our building, are masks and social distancing required?
So what employers should be doing is they should continue to follow the CDC's recommendations, which is you need to continue with the masks and the social distancing and being generally aware of the cleanliness of your environment, using hand sanitizer. You should continue with all those protocols, even if everybody is vaccinated at this time. And employers, I would really encourage you to check out the CDC's website on a regular basis. It's pretty user-friendly, and they do update it quite frequently, and it has specific tips about social distancing and the mask requirements and how employers should be dealing with employees who have been potentially exposed to the virus. What are the quarantine recommendations? But for now, where we stand today, employers should continue to follow their prior mask policies and still have employees continue to do that.
If I could comment on that, Kim, thanks for sharing that. And I think that's one of the biggest questions, and I know we're hearing from a lot of companies that, they're hearing of other states that are opening up 100%, and wondering when Ohio is going to be, part of that, which we're all, waiting for that to happen. But I think, thank you for sharing the reinforcement of, continuing your existing policies and to not let your guard down, because that, again, can cause concern with your employees, especially as, if you've had people that are out that are coming back into the workforce. That's a very big concern.
Thank you, guys. The next question I have here is, I lost it. Okay, here we go. If we have an incentive program for employees getting vaccinated, I read somewhere that it's okay to ask if the employee, if they have been vaccinated, but not okay to ask which vaccine or dates or doses. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would limit your inquiries to the bare information necessary. If you're doing the incentive-based vaccination program, really the only need you have is to know whether somebody was vaccinated or not, and therefore whether they qualify for the incentive. Asking for any additional information, you're potentially treading into dangerous territory. So yeah, asking for the type of vaccine the employee got, you don't need that information. You just want to know whether or not they were vaccinated.
Great. And the next question is, do you have any sample language for a mandatory vaccination policy?
Yes, I do. I don't have it before me right now, but I have helped many businesses out with different types of vaccination policies, whether it be incentive-based, mandatory, or just simply encouraging employees to get the vaccine. So yeah, that's something we have certainly assisted clients with before at my firm.
The next question I have here is, if you know that they have been vaccinated, how do you work through ensuring they receive the second or third shot?
So sort of holding an employee's hand through the process, I wouldn't think that would be a good idea. If you have a mandatory vaccination policy, for example, you can ask employees if they are fully vaccinated. If their vaccine requires 2 shots, ask them if and when they get their second shot. But you shouldn't be helping employees schedule their vaccine or really getting into the logistical details of making sure the employee gets the second vaccine. But you can ask them if they have been fully vaccinated, if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, or if you have an incentive-based vaccination policy, you can ask them if they've been fully vaccinated. But you don't have an obligation as an employer to go out and schedule the second vaccine with the healthcare provider if the employee is getting the 2-dose vaccine.
Great. We have a few more questions here. So if you guys have any more questions, make sure to send those in because we do have some extra time. But the next question we have here is, if we offer the FFCRA voluntary pay at the beginning of the year, do we have to continue throughout the year? When are we allowed to stop paying
it? Currently, where it stands right now, the voluntary FFCRA leave is in effect through the end of September this year. There could be an extension. We don't know at this time, but we do know that that is the current voluntary time period.
All righty. The next question I have here is, we kind of touched on this, but just to clarify, is it okay to require documentation of vaccination?
Yes, you can require documentation of vaccination. However, you want to make sure that no medical information is included on that documentation. For example, if an employee gets vaccination from their healthcare provider and they provide the medical record to their employer, that includes family medical history, pre-existing conditions, allergies, any other medical information, the employee should not be including that along with their record of vaccination. That it should merely be the record of vaccination and not include any medical information.
Great, and it looks like that might be our last question. If you guys want to give some final thoughts, to wait for any stragglers that might come in.
Again, as we've mentioned before, a lot of this is new territory, and we will continue to monitor and provide updates as we move through the next couple months. Definitely in a better place than we were last year at this time, so trying to be positive as well. And there are definitely resources available to help you. And I think from the HR perspective, it's very important that as an employer, that you're looking at your leave policies and your handbooks to ensure that they're updated to reflect your workplace violence, your harassment, especially with the FFCRA leave, and how does that tie into family medical leave, et cetera. So there's a lot of underlying policies that work hand in hand. So it is the best practice to ensure that you have those updated as well. Kim?
Yeah, I completely agree with Renee, and to touch on what Renee said earlier, we're not out of the woods yet. And even though we seem to see the light at the end of the tunnel, employers still have a lot of legal obligations they need to comply with, and a lot of considerations in helping keep them, frankly, out of legal trouble. You have to consider a variety of both federal and state workplace laws when people are requesting accommodations related to COVID-19. People are still getting sick with COVID-19, so you still need to be considering the Family Medical Leave Act. If you have 50 or more employees, you need to consider workers' compensation if somebody contracts COVID-19 in the course of their employment. You need to consider the Fair Labor Standards Act if you're providing incentive pay to employees to get the vaccination. That likely qualifies as a non-discretionary bonus that needs to be included in the employee's regular rate of pay for purposes of computing overtime. So there's a lot of moving parts here still. So we've gone a long way when it comes to the vaccine and hopefully getting out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but employers really need to be diligent in considering what are my legal obligations when a COVID-19 situation arises in the workplace. So I know Renee and I have both helped employers throughout this process, so we can, both Rea Associates and Critchfield can serve as a resource for people who are looking for guidance on the issue.
Great, thanks, ladies. And we do have 2 more questions, and then we will wrap it up today. So the first question I have here is, should employers consider vaccine policies for all other types of illnesses moving forward, or just COVID vaccines?
I would be pretty careful with that right now. I think it's too soon to be thinking through mandatory vaccines for employees in a workplace where you haven't previously implemented mandatory vaccines. I know we've seen mandatory vaccine policies in the healthcare field, so that isn't out of the normal for healthcare providers to have such a requirement in place. But short of mandating flu vaccines and certain other vaccines in the healthcare field, I think it would be pretty bold to jump into mandating other types of vaccines just yet. Not to say that wouldn't be a possibility, but I think it would be important to get through the COVID-19 pandemic first, and then very carefully consider if you're going to mandate other vaccines in the future, because you do have a lot of legal requirements to keep in mind: workers' compensation, and then the ADA and Title VII accommodation process. So is it an option? Sure, but you should certainly consult with legal counsel before you go down that road.
Great, and the last question we have here, it seems to be a lot of FFCRA questions. So this one is saying, if the FFCRA is now optional, can we offer this to those with old qualifying situations and not for the vaccine portion if we are not making it mandatory?
If I understand the question correctly, so they're asking if the previous criteria for leave is still in existence, even though it's voluntary at this point. Is that correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And yes, that is, the existing criteria is still the same with the addition of the 2 additional for the related to the COVID vaccine.
And one more. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to piggyback on what Renee was saying. So yes, all those requirements are still in place. And even though it's a voluntary program, and so you could choose if you want to provide it to employees, you cannot pick and choose what qualifying reasons you are going to cover. So if you're providing the FFCRA leave, if somebody qualifies under the reasons set forth in the Act, in the American Rescue Plan, you cannot pick and choose which parts of the law you want to comply with.
Sorry, I know I said that was the last one, but just we have a lot of clarifying questions. We want to make sure that everybody understands. So just to confirm, an employer cannot ask if an employee is vaccinated unless mandatory policy is in place. Is that correct?
So the best practice would be to limit asking employees if they've been vaccinated if there's a mandatory policy in place. You can ask if you, for example, have an incentive program, but if you don't have an incentive program in place and you don't have a mandatory vaccine policy in place, the best practice is you don't need to be asking employees if they've been vaccinated unless you have some other good faith basis or legitimate business justification for asking for that information. Merely being curious probably isn't sufficient to have you be requesting this information of employees.
All righty, ladies, that was it. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on navigating the COVID-19 vaccine in the workplace, answering your common questions. We hope that Kim and Renee were able to provide you with some valuable information. If you sign off today and realize you have additional questions, you're always welcome to reach out to Kim and Renee directly. You can also contact any of our RAE team members from the firm's website. And don't forget to watch your inbox for an evaluation survey. Access the recording of today's webinar and more. Thank you guys. We hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.